You're tuned to the Nowhere Signal. What you're about to hear was never meant to be found.
Julian Kale hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night in over a year. He wasn't quite sure when it had started. Maybe it was after his father died, or maybe it was during that bitter stretch of winter when his apartment building's heat had failed and the days bled together in cold silence. Regardless, the result was the same: long nights spent staring at the ceiling, counting cracks, watching shadows crawl from one wall to another. He tried everything. Melatonin, white noise, herbal teas, meditation apps that promised to bring peace with ocean waves and distant whale calls. Nothing worked. Julian existed in a haze. The days were manageable, routine kept him going, but the nights were something else entirely. As soon as the sun dipped behind the apartment buildings, a kind of buzzing started in the back of his skull. Not literal, but real all the same. Like the world was winding down and his mind refused to follow. At first, it was just sleeplessness. Then came the dreams. Only, they didn't come when he was asleep. They came while he was still awake, slivers of moments that didn't belong to him. He would be standing at the sink, and suddenly he'd smell rain on pavement and feel the rush of a train passing, yet he wasn't near any tracks. Or he'd blink and see a flash of a girl laughing on a swing in a backyard he didn't recognize. At 2:17 a.m. on a particularly restless Tuesday, Julian gave up on sleep entirely. He slipped into his worn slippers, wrapped himself in his father's old sweater, and shuffled to the small kitchenette for a glass of water. The apartment was silent. Not just quiet, silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. And then, he noticed it. A door. Right there in the far corner of his living room, beside the bookshelf he'd built himself years ago. The bookshelf he dusted weekly. The bookshelf that had never had a door next to it. He stared at it. It was narrow, maybe 6 feet tall, and made of dark wood that didn't match any trim in the apartment. There was no knob, just a brass handle, one of those old-fashioned ones, the kind you see in Victorian manors or forgotten basements. His heart thudded. He should have been afraid. He wasn't. Something about it called to him. Julian took one last sip of water, set the glass on the counter, and stepped forward. He pressed his hand to the door. It was cold to the touch. The handle turned easily under his palm. With a soft click, the door opened inward, revealing not the hallway of his apartment building, not another room, but a spiraling corridor lined with endless shelves and flickering candles. The scent of dust, ink, and something faintly sweet, like lavender, wafted out. He hesitated at the threshold. Just for a second. Then Julian stepped inside. And the door closed behind him. The first thing Julian noticed was the air. It didn't feel like any place he'd ever been. Not cold, not warm, just still. Like the air hadn't moved in centuries. Yet it didn't feel stale. It was calm, measured, almost like the breath between thoughts. He stood just inside the threshold, and the door behind him had vanished. Where a solid wall should have been, there was now only more corridor, curving gently to the left and right, each bend disappearing into candlelit gloom. The walls were made of stone. Not drywall, not brick, stone, old and perfectly smooth, as though polished by time rather than tools. The shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, each filled with books that bore no titles. Some were thick, others narrow. Their spines were bound in worn leather, frayed cloth, even materials Julian couldn't name. There were no labels. No signs. No sound. Not even the crackle of the flames from the floating candles. And then he noticed something impossible. The ceiling above him showed stars. Not a painted ceiling. Not a projection. Stars. A perfect, shifting sky, twilight blue and deep indigo, speckled with constellations Julian didn't recognize. And a slow swirl of silver mist that moved like it had purpose. He took a step forward, and the stone floor didn't echo. It simply accepted his presence. The hallway bent again, and around the corner was a desk. Not a reception desk. Not a welcome center. Just a desk. Heavy wood. Atop it, a brass oil lamp and a long black quill in an inkwell. Sitting behind the desk was a woman. She was pale in the way paper is pale after years in shadow. Her hair was white, not gray, and coiled in a knot behind her head. Her eyes were dark, but not unkind. She wore robes of deep blue and gray that shimmered faintly as she shifted. Julian didn't know whether to speak. She looked at him. First time, she asked, her voice low, like she didn't want to disturb the air around her. Julian nodded. He tried to find his voice. "Where am I?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she gestured toward the shelves behind him. "You're in the between," she said. He turned, following her gesture. There were thousands of shelves. Tens of thousands. Each perfectly spaced, each filled with those same untitled volumes. "This isn't a library," he whispered, almost to himself. She tilted her head. "It remembers more than most libraries ever could." Julian stepped closer to the desk. "What are they?" "Lives. Moments. Dreams. Things that weren't, things that almost were." She reached for a book without looking and slid it across the desk to him. "Read one. But only one tonight." "Why only one?" "The between is patient, but not always forgiving." Julian picked up the book. The cover was worn leather, warm to the touch despite the air. He opened it. And his breath caught. It wasn't a story. It was a memory. Not his own. He was standing in the middle of a sunlit orchard. He could smell apples. He could feel the breeze, hear the distant sound of someone calling a name, a child's name. He turned only to remember this wasn't real. It was someone else's life. Someone else's moment. And it felt more real than anything he had lived in the past year. When he blinked, he was back in the between. The woman behind the desk was watching. "One each night," she repeated. "No more." Julian's fingers lingered on the page. He didn't want to leave. But the candle beside the desk flickered, and he suddenly felt very, very tired. For the first time in months. Julian woke up in his apartment. He was on the couch, still wrapped in his father's old sweater, a closed book resting on his chest. Except it wasn't one of his books. The cover was blank. No title. Just worn brown leather that looked older than anything he owned. He blinked, sat upright, and glanced around the room. The mysterious door was gone. So were the stone walls, the stars above, and the woman with the dark eyes. Had he dreamed it? He placed the book on the coffee table and rubbed his face. He felt rested, more than he had in months. Not just rested, clear. Like a fog had lifted from the corners of his mind. Later that day, as he sat at his desk working remotely for a dull corporate account, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd read. The orchard. The laughter. The sense that he had been there, even if only briefly. That night, the book was still on the coffee table. He picked it up. There was no new door. No portal. But as soon as he opened the book, something shifted. The words inside changed. They rearranged themselves line by line, and a new memory formed on the page. A new life. A different moment. Julian sat back on the couch and began to read. And again, he was pulled in. This time, he was a girl of 12 standing at the edge of a cliff on a gray morning, clutching a compass that pointed nowhere. The wind stung her cheeks. There was shouting behind her, soldiers, uniforms, something about a signal, but the girl didn't flinch. She stepped forward. Then the scene ended. Julian gasped. He wasn't sure how long he'd been reading. Time was strange now. The between didn't need doors anymore. Each night, the book called him. It was never the same story. Never the same person. Each memory was vivid, detailed, and utterly immersive. They weren't fantasy, they were echoes of something real. Some were mundane, a woman washing her hair in the sink before her wedding. Others were bizarre, a man climbing an invisible staircase that never ended. And one night, the story was about him. Julian Kale. Not a fictional version, him. He was in the library. He was holding the book. Reading. And someone was watching. He shut the book quickly. But he couldn't stop the chill running through him. The next evening, the woman from the between appeared in his apartment. Just standing near the window as though she'd been there for hours. "Too many pages," she said softly. Julian stood up. "What does that mean?" She didn't answer at first. She walked slowly to the table and picked up the book. "You're not just remembering others anymore. They're remembering you." He looked at the window. The reflection of the room was off. Slightly delayed. Slightly different. Julian backed away. "Why is this happening?" he asked. She looked at him for a long time. "Because you're not the only one reading." And with that, she was gone. Julian stopped sleeping. Not because of insomnia this time, but because every time he tried to sleep, he ended up somewhere else. Not dreaming. Not quite awake either. He'd open his eyes to find himself sitting at the desk in the between, the endless shelves behind him, books waiting, each one shifting, pulsing faintly with stories not yet opened. He began keeping a journal, but even his handwriting looked different now. Sharper, almost etched. Sometimes, when he wasn't paying attention, the pages would turn on their own. One morning, Julian found that his own journal had a memory recorded inside it he had never written. It described a moment from his childhood, a day in the park, the sun setting, his brother throwing a football too far into a thicket of trees. The memory was perfect, even the sound of cicadas humming in the grass. But Julian didn't have a brother. He read it 3 times before closing the journal, heart racing. That night, when he returned to the library, he found the desk abandoned. The woman was gone. In her place sat a note: "You've passed the threshold. This place no longer waits for you. You are now part of its memory." He turned around, and the candles began to flicker wildly. One by one, they dimmed until only a faint silver glow remained. And then the voices began. Not loud, just whispers, murmurs between the shelves. They weren't speaking to him. They weren't even speaking in language. It was like trying to hear a radio transmission from a century ago, warped, frayed, overlapping signals. But one phrase emerged, again and again: "He reads us." Julian stepped backward, nearly stumbling into a low bookshelf that hadn't been there before. When he looked down, he saw something different. A book not worn or ancient, but brand new. Matte black cover. The title stamped in silver foil: Julian Kale. Archive initiate, his name. Inside, the pages were blank. Except for the first one. It read, "You are not just the reader now. You are the remembered. What you write, we keep. What you see, we echo. What you fear, we record." Julian slammed it shut. The room shifted. Shelves groaned. The ceiling sky above him began to swirl violently. A single silver thread dropped down, hanging motionless like a pendulum. The moment he touched it, the shelves all around him folded away like shadows retreating from fire. The library vanished. He woke up on his couch, the book gone. No sign of the thread, the note, the shelves. Just his own journal, now filled from cover to cover in strange entries. Most weren't his. A few were. But one page in the very center was in different handwriting. His brother's. Julian didn't leave his apartment for 3 days. He stopped answering calls, texts, emails, everything. Time slipped past him like smoke. The journal sat on the kitchen table. He avoided it at first. But by the 3rd night, he gave in. He flipped to the page written in his brother's handwriting. The entry was short, and it chilled him: "Don't listen to them. You were never supposed to open the black book." That was all. Julian set the journal down and stared at the floor for a long time. He thought about throwing it away, burning it, locking it up. Instead, he opened a blank notebook, took a pen, and started writing, stream of consciousness, anything to feel grounded. He wrote about the library. About the woman. About the stars. About the strange stories that had passed through him. And then, with trembling hands, he wrote, "I don't know what's real anymore. But I need answers." He didn't expect anything to happen. But the words on the page began to shift. Slowly. Ink swirled. Rearranged. And a new message appeared, then returned. Julian blinked. The room around him darkened, not like a blackout but as if reality dimmed. Like a spotlight narrowing around him. The desk returned. The candles lit. The shelves loomed. And there, standing in front of him, was not the woman, but something else. A figure dressed in robes stitched from hundreds of overlapping pages. No face. Just the faint outline of two eyes drawn in ink. The figure placed a finger on the black book. "You read," it said in a voice that echoed in Julian's chest. "Now write." Julian stepped closer. "What happens if I do?" The figure turned a page in the black book. There was an image hand-drawn in charcoal of Julian asleep on his couch, an open book on his chest, a figure watching from the window. Then the page turned again. And again. Each one was an event he hadn't lived yet. One showed him arguing with someone on the street. Another had him stepping into traffic. One showed his apartment. Empty, abandoned, with books scattered across the floor and ink dripping from the ceiling like rain. "You're showing me my future," Julian said. "No," the figure corrected. "We're showing you possibility. The library remembers all outcomes. Which will be written depends on you." Julian closed the book. "Then I won't write at all." The figure leaned forward, pages rustling like dry leaves. "That is also a story. The one where you vanish." And then the shelves began to crack. Julian dropped the book and ran, but no matter how far he went, the shelves kept rising, stretching out, reshaping. He tripped, fell, hit the floor, and woke up. Apartment. Couch. Quiet hum of a street lamp outside. Everything still. But when he looked at his notebook, a new sentence had appeared beneath his final entry. "We are always reading." Julian tried everything. He stopped writing. He stopped reading. He avoided sleep. He filled his days with noise, with TV, with company. Anything to drown out the quiet pull of the library. But it was no use. Every night at exactly 2:03 a.m., the candles returned. The shelves. The whispering ink. The journal. And the figure, now always waiting. The figure had stopped speaking. It only watched now, expectantly. Julian began writing again, but only to delay it. To keep it from watching. The stories he wrote were meaningless nonsense, grocery lists, fake journal entries, pages of numbers. But the figure never moved. Until one night, Julian opened the black book. And there, for the first time, the final page had something written on it. "The story ends when you stop being afraid of it." Julian blinked. He stared at the words, then at the figure, then back again. "That's not an answer," he whispered. The library responded with silence. Heavy and thick. He turned back to the black book. Every page was now filled. Memories, fictions, fears, things that hadn't happened but could. And at the very end, a signature in unfamiliar handwriting. His. Not Julian Kale. Not even J. Kale. Just remembered. He looked up, and the library began folding inward. Like paper collapsing into ash. Shelves became lines. Lines became dust. And the figure said, one final time, "The last page was never yours. It was ours." Julian opened his eyes. Morning. Bright sunlight through the window. His apartment quiet. He picked up his notebook. Every page was blank. Not erased, just empty. Except the inside of the back cover. There, etched faintly into the cardboard, were 3 words we still remember.
The nowhere signal will return tomorrow. Until then, sleep light.